battle to rebuild. The fire is extinguished at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. What experts are saying about the damage and the efforts to renovate one of the most iconic churches on the planet. Global reaction. Pope Francis and other world leaders weigh in on the devastation. Lucky escape. Analysis of some pieces of art removed from the cathedral just before the blaze began. And trying to make amends. How students at a Jesuit university are addressing its history of owning slaves. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, April 16th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Mark Irons in for Lauren Ashburn. It's known as Our Lady of Paris, an iconic piece of Gothic architecture with more than 13 million visitors every year. Yesterday, it was engulfed in flames, but thanks to hours of intense firefighting, Notre Dame Cathedral still stands. 9 hours after it started, the fire that engulfed the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is finally out. The world watched in horror as one of the most recognized buildings on the planet and one of the most important to the Catholic faith burned for hours on end, flames shooting into the sky and smoke billowing over the city.
Everybody's crying. It's very sad because Notre Dame de Paris is the symbol of Paris and the symbol of France.
Gasp from onlookers as its iconic spire toppled.
It's horrific. We heard the tower fall, and it was the worst sound, and people screamed.
Around 400 firefighters battled the blaze at the more than 800-year-old church. While the spire and the oak wood roof were destroyed, the two bell towers in the front facade were saved, along with some of the most precious religious artifacts, including the crown of thorns that Jesus Christ wore at his crucifixion. French President Emmanuel Macron vowed that they would rebuild Notre Dame and will be launching an international fundraiser. That message of hope is what rang out louder than the flames.
This goes beyond Paris. People are reacting worldwide, and the young people behind me show the power, faith, the power of a message of peace.
Joining me now by Skype from Paris is Alexander Helwani, who was outside Notre Dame yesterday as the flames spread. Alexander, welcome to the broadcast. Describe what it was like to see this unfold yesterday. We've all seen the images. How has this impacted you emotionally?
It really shattered me emotionally. It was like seeing your own mother dying in front of you, and to see your mother cathedral being burnt like this on the very first day of Holy Week felt like a calling to me, really, a call to repentance. And the first thing I did actually once the cathedral was on fire was to rush to the nearest church to confess. And I felt this urge inside of myself, actually.
And those are some pictures that you took yesterday. What's the mood like in Paris today?
It's really weird. You can feel that the entire population, Catholic and not Catholic, is in mourning. Our Lady of Paris is really the mother to all Parisians, especially for all young Catholics. But the thing is, young Catholics are praying everywhere. The churches are packed, the masses are packed, and you can feel the hope of resurrection, of Easter, already here within us all.
And you attended a Mass this evening to pray for Notre Dame. As a Catholic, as a Parisian, what does Notre Dame mean to you?
Everything. It's our mother. She's literally looking after all of us. It's the mother church of all churches in France, of all churches of Europe. So it really means a lot. To be robbed of her during this Holy Week was really hard for all of us. But the good thing is indeed that we're all praying and that we're all ablaze with this hope of resurrection, of Easter here and now.
So is there a sense of optimism? Is there a sense of rebuilding for the future that's already present there on the ground?
Oh yes, definitely. The donations have poured in immensely, and we're all trying to do anything that we can so that we can rebuild this church and rebuild our Church of France, because the material destruction is also a way to show us our inner destruction, So as much as we want to rebuild the cathedral, we also want to rebuild our church, our living church, and there's this real effort that you can sense going on.
Alexandra Helwani, thank you for sharing your story. Pope Francis says he joins the people of Paris in their sorrow. In a letter today to the Archbishop of Paris, the Holy Father says in part, quote, "May Notre Dame Cathedral once again become, thanks to reconstruction efforts and the mobilization of all, a sign of the faith of those who built it." The Vatican also is offering its expertise in the rebuilding project. World leaders are also offering their sympathies and support to the French people. Hundreds of millions of dollars have already been pledged to help rebuild the cathedral. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby joins us outside the French Embassy in Washington. Wyatt?
Good evening, Mark. An outpouring of grief and sadness after yesterday's fire. Throughout the day, supporters have been coming here to lay flowers just outside of the Embassy of France. Americans and others from around the world wanting to let the French people know we stand with them. Firefighters, experts, and architects began assessing the damage to the Notre Dame Cathedral, one day after French President Emmanuel Macron voiced his sympathy to the faithful.
Une pensée pour les catholiques de France et partout à travers le monde.
Macron told Catholics around the world who are celebrating Holy Week, "I know how you feel, and we are with you." President Donald Trump offered his condolences to the French president.
It's one of the great treasures of the world, the greatest artists in the world.
Other world leaders, like the Australian Prime Minister, shared memories of past visits to the cathedral.
Jenny and I were there almost 30 years ago when we'd been married only a couple of years, and it was a very special memory for us, so it was upsetting to see that day.
The Prime Minister said Australians are willing to help, as are rulers from dozens of countries. Today, the head of the European Union, Donald Tusk, called on all members to help France rebuild the fire-ravaged cathedral.
But at stake here is something more than just material help. The burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral has again made us aware that we are bound by something more important and more profound than treaties.
A number of French billionaires have already pledged at least $600 million combined, and even more is expected from collections around the world. Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, prays the Church in France will be able to materially and spiritually rebuild.
I remember our song, "From the Ashes, We Rise Up." We had Ash Wednesday. We want to rise up with Jesus at Easter. And I believe that there'll be some rising from this dying.
Cardinal Dolan says the Notre Dame Cathedral is not just an important historic and artistic landmark. He says it represents the love of God and his presence among us. He hopes the fire will become an opportunity for onlookers to lift their minds and hearts back to the Lord. Mark?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the French Embassy in Washington. Thank you, Wyatt. Notre Dame is home to relics, stained glass, and other works of art of immeasurable value. Last week, a crane removed religious statues on top of the roof of the cathedral for restoration work. The copper statues included 12 apostles and 4 evangelists. It all happened less than a week from yesterday's fire. We're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Lev, art historian and author of How Catholic Art Saved the Faith. In the New York Post, you write the angels are weeping over the ravages of Notre Dame. What does this cathedral mean to you artistically and spiritually?
This cathedral means so many things to me. It's a part of my childhood when I used to read books like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I dreamed about being in Europe. As an art historian, I began to learn about the brilliance of the engineering, this incredible combination of structure, architecture, and faith. And then, as someone who has actually been to the Cathedral of Notre Dame to kiss the crown of thorns, I mean, it's amazing. It's devastating to be thinking that will not happen again, not anytime soon.
Yesterday we saw Parisians and the whole world mourn as the cathedral burned. Why do you think this tragedy is hitting everybody so hard?
Well, I think it's a really interesting thing when you think about it. There are people who are talking about the cultural loss. There are people who are talking about the historical loss. But then there were also those people who were on their knees praying, the people who were singing the Ave Maria. And I think it tells us what Notre Dame really is. It's an ecclesia. You saw ecclesia is a word that means people gathered together. They were gathered together maybe for different reasons as far as they thought. But literally, Notre Dame was doing what she was built to do. She brought all these people together.
And now we're hearing France's richest businessman, Bernard Arnault, has pledged $226 million for the reconstruction of the cathedral. What will that entail? And is the Notre Dame the world knew and loved, is it gone forever?
I think that's a bunch of different questions all at once, but let me start with, first of all, it's very, very moving to see in the midst of disaster how quickly the best of people came out. How can I help? How can I make this better? What can I contribute? It's a deeply important thing to remember, that in the midst of this tragedy we see such generosity. I think the second thing is what it's going to entail is going to be a tremendous amount of study to understand exactly what mechanisms need to be shored up and how to do it. We are not building in 1163, we're not building in 1350, we're not building even in 1861, we're building in 2019. So they're going to have to adapt the ancientness of this church to new building techniques and the way that we build today. So it'll be very interesting to see how that turns out.
Absolutely. And finally, Liz, how do you think beautiful cathedrals like Notre Dame help us live out our faith?
I think many people sort of take these things for granted, right? So you pass in front of it every day. I like to have my coffee in front of it. I like to send a postcard with it. Many people probably walked by Notre Dame seeing the long line outside and said, oh, I'll do it some other time. And they didn't realize that that's part of the backdrop of our lives. A beautiful church, a beautiful gathering place, is a place that becomes a backdrop of our existence. How many people made their marriage proposals in front of that portal? How many coffins were carried out while people mourned? How many moments of people's lives, beyond the great kings and the Napoleons and the trials of Joan of Arc, beyond that, how many of simple, normal people's lives were exalted because they had such a noble and magnificent framework that spoke to the eternity that we all share?
Elizabeth Lev, art historian and author of How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, The Triumph of Beauty and Truth in Counter-Reformation Art. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Coming up, analysis of what Notre Dame Cathedral meant to France and the people of Paris. Welcome back. I'm Mark Irons in for Lauren Ashburn. Last night, video went viral showing the moment when people in Paris gathered near the burning Notre Dame singing. Singing Ave Maria, young people took a moment to reflect and look at the cathedral as firefighters worked to put out the fire. It took more than 12 hours to extinguish the flames. So Lynn Toddie, Europe correspondent for the National Catholic Register, joins us now from Rome, where she is based. So Lynn is from Paris. Our condolences to you, first of all, as a Parisian. What does Notre Dame mean to the French people?
Notre Dame has endured for more than 8 centuries. It is the most emblematic monument of all France. It has been the muse of countless artists and writers over the centuries. It is a huge symbol in France. It's a huge loss for us. The whole France is weeping today. There is a whole part of our soul that has disappeared yesterday. So it is a huge symbol that has disappeared yesterday, really.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And you say it's hard not to see the fire as a symbol of the deep wounds affecting the Church of France. Explain what you mean by that.
It happened a month after the arson at the very emblematic Parisian Saint-Sulpice, the church in Paris. We are facing a huge wave of desecration and vandalism in many churches in France. So there is a context of a huge crisis in the Church of France. We are also facing the sex abuse crisis. Less and less people attend Mass. France basically removed God from its public space. So secularism has become the absolute norm. So when we saw this morning the image of the cross standing among the wreckage, for many priests and many Catholic people, it was a symbol, like an allegory of such crisis.
No doubt that was a powerful image. Now, this tragedy took place at the beginning of Holy Week. How do you think it will impact the French this Easter?
So the people that were looking at this very emblematic picture of the cross standing among the wreckage say that it could be a starting point, a seed for our spiritual growth in France. this catharsis could be a very something that could awake people. And we are a few days away from the Passion of Christ, so we must focus on the hope that Christ gave us with his resurrection. And I think we will have this state of mind in Easter. The rector of Notre Dame called French people to keep faith in the future and to become cathedral builders yet again.
So Lynn Toddie, Europe correspondent for the National Catholic Register. I know it's a difficult time. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To read Solin's latest take on the highest symbol of Catholicism in France, visit our partners, National Catholic Register, at ncregister.com. Up next, what President Donald Trump is saying about the Mueller report just days before it's expected to be released. And students at a Jesuit university address its history of owning slaves. Welcome back. I'm Mark Irons, in for Lauren Ashburn. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez renews her calls to abolish the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE.
And I've said, on multiple occasions that I don't believe that an agency that systematically and repeatedly violates human rights I don't think that agency can be reformed. I think it has to be abolished, and I think we need to figure out a new way of doing things.
Her criticism comes as at least 2,000 migrants, most of them from Honduras, are trying to reach the U.S. on foot. The caravan currently is in Mexico. President Donald Trump continues his attacks on the Mueller report. A redacted version is expected to be released this week. The findings of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe into whether there was collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign may arrive Thursday. The president isn't waiting. Yesterday on social media, he called for an investigation into Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. He also wants to know how the two-year probe into his campaign began. The more than a dozen 2020 Democratic candidates together have raised roughly $75 million. Now that's compared to President Trump's $30 million in 2020 funding. But the Democrats' first quarter fundraising is short of candidates in 2008. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us now why those numbers are important. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Mark. Money alone doesn't win elections. You just ask Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton. But with so many Democrats running for the White House, donations can reveal something. Which candidates are rising to the top? Which candidates are gaining the hearts of the base?
Bernie Sanders and O'Rourke seem to be doing very well with small dollar donors. Definitely gives you an early indication of where the passion is on the base. But we've seen Mayor Buttigieg doing quite well recently too. So these things can change over the course of an election, depending on who's garnering the lion's share of media coverage.
Here's a look at the Democratic totals for the first 3 months of this year. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders wins, taking in $18 million. Second is California Senator Kamala Harris with $12 million. Former Texas Representative Beto O'Rourke comes in third with just over $9 million. And South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg raised $7 million. Democrats' $75 million first quarter is short. In 2008, the 8 Democratic candidates took in $80 million. Now, some donors might be waiting on the sidelines, waiting for some of the more than a dozen candidates to leave the race. Also, former Vice President Joe Biden hasn't yet jumped in. A big test for all of these candidates will be in June, the first Democratic debate. Mark?
Correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Students at Georgetown University are willing to pay for the sin of slavery. In the 19th century, the Jesuit-owned university owned slaves and sold them to pay off debt. After a vote last week, students only need administration approval to create one of the first reparations funds at a major U.S. institution. The student body at a prominent Catholic school has spoken. Georgetown University was once involved in the slave trade, and now undergraduates want to make amends.
Some sort of way of saying sorry so that we can get past our original sin of slavery.
We spent more than an hour on campus, and it wasn't hard for us to find students who voted for paying an additional $27 fee per semester. The money would go toward projects in underprivileged communities where descendants of enslaved people now live.
Because I believe it's a step in the right direction.
Slavery is a big part of America's history. The African American community still faces so many different obstacles because of the history of our nation through slavery and then Jim Crow.
And I am immensely proud of this group of students.
Guilford Queen graduated in the class of '79. He now volunteers with the Georgetown Slavery Archive Project, sifting through documents from the 1830s that show the Jesuit organized sale of 272 slaves, some of whom are family.
Yes, I have found a few relatives. I think we all have to be very, very clear on what happened and what we want to do about it.
The majority of Georgetown student voters supported paying what's called the reconciliation contribution, but the fee was opposed by about 1,300 voters. Of the 7 students we spoke with on camera, we did find one.
Because I think that current students here aren't responsible in any way for the sale of slaves all those years ago, so they shouldn't have to pay for it.
We also heard a few concerns about how the money would ultimately be spent. But EWTN radio host and pro-life Catholic Gloria Purvis praises the students' efforts. She pointed us to the faults of Adam and Eve and said the stain of sin has a lasting impact.
None of us were there that committed that sin, but we all took on the effects of that sin. So I'm hoping the Catholics will see it in that light and not take the stance, which I'm hearing all too often, is, they didn't own slaves, they didn't do anything. And I'm like, well, especially during Holy Week, Jesus didn't commit any sin, but he took on the cross for us.
For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, thank you for watching. I'm Mark Irons. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. We'll end tonight honoring Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI on his 92nd birthday. Good night and God bless.